I am now going to introduce Dhesen Moodley. Dhesen, as I said, is the Managing Director of Globeleq South Africa. I need to stop sharing my screen, and I will hand over to Dhesen and ask Dhesen to introduce himself and do his presentation. Thank you, Dhesen.
Thanks, Craig. Hi, everyone. I am going to just get my screen up. And yeah, it's a great pleasure to talk to all of you today. I've been with Globeleq for about 4 years now, but I was involved in the finance and investment world for most of my career. So it's a world that I miss, and it's great to be talking to you on an investment seminar, but it is a tough topic. And I just want to check, can you hear me clearly? Because I've lost my screen.
We can hear you, Dhesen. Can you share your presentation?
I am sharing. Can you not see it?
Oh, okay, I can't. Maybe the audience can. Okay. Okay. That's fine. So, Cyril, can the audience see the presentation?
It's not showing up, Dhesen. Maybe stop sharing and reshare, please.
Okay, let me try that.
There we go. Thank you, Dhesen.
Okay. Right. So, yeah. So it's a difficult topic, which is well, it's a topic I can talk a lot about, but it's not just about the renewable energy landscape and how we can help. It's also about load shedding, which is a really difficult topic. So I'm going to dive straight in. And you can post questions in the chat. We'll get to them at the end, but I'm going to talk for about 15 to 20 minutes and then allow quite a lot of time for Q&A. So, first, the commercial break about the business that I'm with, which is called Globeleq, and many of you may not have heard about Globeleq. We're 20 years old this year. We're an African-focused business. Globeleq was originally a portfolio company within Actis, which is, a global emerging markets private equity business. It was founded 20 years ago. And in 2015, it changed ownership. The current shareholders are British International Investment and Norfund. BII owns 70% of the business and Norfund 30%. And both of those are the development finance institutions of the UK government and the Norwegian government. And when they acquired the business in 2015, they refocused the geographic focus to be just Africa. Prior to that, it was Latin America and also Southeast Asia. And what we do is we develop, own, and operate power businesses in Africa at a utility scale. So we develop them, greenfield developments. We acquire businesses in M&A. And a big part of our team is focused on that front end or the business development end. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But we're also generally a majority shareholder in the projects that we invest in. And we tend to prefer strongly to operate them. It reduces our risk as a majority shareholder. And of course, we can add value because of the expertise across the business. So we're currently spread across 9 countries, including the UK. And new countries that we've entered into the last year and two are Cairo. And in Nairobi, we built our first solar plant. And we've also ventured into Nigeria in a new business. But the business before that is West Africa focused in thermal, Cote d'Ivoire and Cameroon. And then East Africa, Tanzania, Kenya, also thermal. And in South Africa, renewables. And let me talk a little bit about the South African business. So very proud to say we have about 100 employees in the South African business spread out across 5 provinces. We have an office in Rosebank. I was about to say Melrose Arch, but we recently moved. And again, Globeleq is a majority owner of 8 power projects in South Africa, where we provide full operations and maintenance services on the solar parks. The solar parks, I'll talk a little bit more in detail about them soon, are in the Northern Cape, and we have one in the Free State, one in Limpopo. And the 2 wind farms, one in the Eastern Cape, one in the Western Cape. And We're very proud of our contribution to the electricity system, and of course that we've grown a South African focused team that is providing this technical operations, asset management service. Asset management in this context doesn't mean the same thing as fund management or the very well paid asset management community in financial services. This means the technical asset management, which is really monitoring how a power plant is performing and making sure that it's optimized at all times. Part of the design of the renewable energy program, which is quite significant, is that government provided for the original design in 2010 that community ownership would be provided through community trusts. So we also provide administration services for the community trust across all 8 projects. And economic development, where I'll share a slide, which is the impact of the entire program. But economic development is very much part of our contract with government. We spend money in the local community in which a power plant is built, and that money is spent on socioeconomic development, which is focused usually on early childhood development, education, healthcare, and then enterprise development, which is the more challenging task because a lot of renewable energy plants are based in rural areas. But it's where you try and find entrepreneurs with a market in that community which can be developed and to fund them and hopefully, provide them with and our exit. We exit as a funder and that they continue as a sustainable business, and that's a real challenge because of the level of economic activity in some of the areas. Also proud to say that we've built in Cape Town a remote operations center, which provides remote monitoring services to the 2 new projects that I spoke about earlier, which is the Malindi Solar Project and in Egypt, the Arc Solar Project. And we provide support services to the business development team, which is focused on Southern Africa. Here's a picture of some of our plants, Aries and Kunkunsis. For those of you thinking about where are these plants based on the geography, the nearest town is Uppington, but these plants are a few hours from each other. Those are 2 small solar plants. Klipjewel, if you've driven along the N2 from Cape Town out past Hermanus, if you pass Caledon, and it's the wind farm on the hill, please, no jokes, because almost every time I tell somebody the story about Klipjewel, they say to me that every time we've driven past this one turbine not working. I promise you, since we've invested in this wind farm, the turbines have operated most of the time. Soutpan is the solar plant in Limpopo, and then Boshoff, Driefontein, and De Aar are in the Northern Cape. And Jeffreys Bay is the flagship wind farm from round 1. It was one of the largest at the time. And as you're driving through the N2 through Jeffreys Bay, it's on either side of the freeway. This is some of the portfolio outside of South Africa that Globeleq is an investor in. And I think the key thing for me to point out is that in the West African portfolio, we have gas and heavy fuel oil generation assets. And that Globeleq believes as a group that we are an energy solutions provider. So where it makes sense for a country to have thermal, and when I say thermal, I mean gas in its generation mix, Globeleq will pursue that development. And to give you a sense of where we have done that successfully, at the bottom of the slide on the left, CTT is the Tamani gas-fired power project, which was one of the largest power projects in the region in the last 10 years, reached financial close last year, and it's in construction. And we have, as a co-shareholder in that project, the government of Mozambique through its utility, and it will contribute about 14% of the power supply in Mozambique. And that's in the middle of construction. The project in the middle, Kuamba, is also in Mozambique with the government as a partner. And it's a very interesting project because it's the first utility scale battery storage and solar facility in the region, and the first one in Mozambique. So that construction hasn't started off very smoothly, but we are hopeful of getting back on track by next year. And then in Zito, the gas-fired power plant in Cote d'Ivoire, is we're expanding that power plant. And this, as you can see, is a phase 4 expansion. And this will provide an additional 2 gigawatt hours per year. So in the countries like Cameroon and Cote d'Ivoire, particularly, the Globeleq power plants provide a significant part of the total generation in the country, and it's done in partnership with the private sector, where the private sector is seen as a strong and capable partner who brings both capital and technical ability into the country. And we do that across the continent with local people. So there's a massive skills transfer and acceleration that comes in through our investment in activities. On the right-hand side is giving you a sense of the business development pipeline. The business is very focused on those two technologies broadly, renewables and gas. And in renewables, I mean utility scale wind and solar, onshore wind and solar PV, and in gas in West Africa. In some markets, we try to do those together, but it really depends on the maturity of the market and the scale and ability of the electricity system to take on combination projects. Okay, so just, about load shedding. I think I took this cue from listening to a few Eskom people in the last few weeks, and to break the ice, I think some of the Eskom people now start telling load shedding jokes to kick off the conversation. And here's some of the memes that I found, because there's now collections of the best load shedding jokes online. But load shedding is no joke. It's been more serious this year than ever before, and its toll on the economy, I think, will only be measured when we're out of load shedding. But it's difficult to explain how much of corporate cash is locked up in balance sheets because of load shedding, how much of pain it's causing to social lives, to families, to children writing the matric exams. But just with a very fragile economy, the impact that it's having on jobs, which we so desperately need, and the ability to get investment while we can't get our house in order. But I'll talk to you a little bit about renewables and where it's going, but I think the key message is there is no easy solution. So about renewable energy, and this is, hopefully where it's a little bit positive. A lot of this is in the public domain, but I'd like to take a step back and talk about the first 10 years of renewable energy in South Africa, because the first project started operations in 2012, and that's when the Globeleq South African business kicked off. So in total, on the left-hand side is a summary of over the 5 different rounds of renewable energy until the end of 2021. There's actually 4 rounds of renewables, but in between there was one specific round called round 3.5 of concentrated solar. There was 6.3 gigawatt procured, out of which 5.7 gigawatt was built and on the grid, generating power at the end of 2021. And you can see the different technologies. The little icons are wind is definitely the largest in terms of construction. 87% of it was operational at the end of last year when we had the last portfolio-wide report from the Department of Energy. And you can see that wind and solar are leading on the CSP side, which is 2292. There was one project which is in construction now. And some of you may have seen that the president was at that project last week. It's the Redstone CSP power plant in the Northern Cape, which is a fascinating piece of technology. So if you can Google that video or visit the Aquapower site, you can learn about it. And then landfill gas, which is the smallest part of the entire procurement program to date. And it's generated the least in terms of installed capacity and actual megawatt hours, which is what I'll talk about a little bit later when we look at the generation trends. But the key thing about renewables, which is the reason that its adoption has been accelerated globally, is because of the second chart in the middle, which is the decline in tariffs, which has been largely a result of as each round has been built. The equipment prices for solar and wind have, decreased dramatically. So you can see that prices in 2021 terms have dropped about a third on average, and that's a combined wind and solar average across all 4 rounds, excluding CSP. And if you compare those prices to the wind and solar prices, for bid window 5, 1.03 compares to at the bottom, and it's kilowatt hours versus megawatt hours. Excuse me for that. So it's around 47 cents, and for wind, 43 cents and 50 cents. 43 cents for solar, and wind was 50 cents. So the bottom line is that renewable energy across the globe is now one of the cheapest new ways to build electricity generation. The challenge with wind and solar, which I'm sure that some of you are thinking about, is what about the intermittency of it? And I think for most energy systems, there's going to be a lot more renewable energy, because when you build it at scale, you have to figure out how do you then build in the flexibility to accommodate the system when it needs what we call now baseload power, but where it needs more stable generation, so a balancing generation profile. And how do you do that while more renewables is built? But certainly policymakers around the world have now adopted renewables as the way that the world will do it, will build new generation because of the cost, but also because of the impacts of climate change. The one thing I do want to say about equipment costs is, the energy sector is, of course, not just in South Africa, but in the middle of a global energy crisis. And post the Russia-Ukraine events of Feb, bid window 6, the tariffs in wind and solar, and that bid closed 2 weeks ago, are likely to be higher than bid window 5. And that's because some of the supply chain shocks are still rippling through the energy system. Back to the first decade and how renewable energy is done. The two maps on the right are the little dots, which you won't be able to read very well. On the top are solar, but if you look at the map on the right, which is colored, the dark orange to red is where you get the best irradiation, which is solar resource in South Africa. And as you would expect, it's on the Northern Cape. But what's interesting, and it was very exciting to hear Eskom talk about it at a seminar 2 weeks ago, is that if you look at Mpumalanga, which on the chart, I'm not using a pointer, let me try to do it. On the chart here, Mpumalanga is up there, so it's not the best resource in South Africa, which is around here. But the resource in Mpumalanga, from a solar perspective, is better than most of the solar resource in Europe, where there's a much larger solar PV fleet. Similarly for wind, this chart, and here the dark orange shows the best wind resource, which for those of you who live around the windy city or traveled through, you know that there's really good wind resource in the Eastern Cape and also in the Western Cape. And for wind, it's not only about where's the best resource. For wind, you also need access to ports and to good transport networks like roads because of the large construction program that's required for a wind farm. So typically the wind farms have been built around the Western Cape. There are some in the Northern Cape now and the Eastern Cape, but nothing in this part of the country. And in the solar side, there's very little, you can see there's very little dots here. There's nothing in KZN yet on the solar side. There's a few projects like ours in Limpopo. And now in the latest bid round, there have been projects bid in Mpumalanga. So that's some of the story for the first 10 years. I think some of the headlines and the reason that, the presidency and there's this renewed government commitment to continuing the renewable energy program is that it's attracted a huge amount of investment. It's been one of the most successful international programs in renewable energy, and it's won awards for that. Between bid window 1 to 4, 210 billion rand, of which 42 billion was from foreign investment. And you can see the difference between equity and debt in the tables below. So there was quite a lot of institutional capital invested, likes of long-term life insurers, pension funds invested in both debt and equity. And I'll come back to that discussion later, but I think it's a very exciting endorsement of when capital sees, which it did by round 2 and round 3, which is the perceived risks around construction, would these projects work at the scale they were being done at the time? The 75 megawatt solar PV projects were amongst the largest in the world. And the fact that they were largely completed on time, in budget, and appeared to be modular almost in terms of construction, institutional investors who got into the earlier rounds had really good returns. And of course, with that pressure on tariff, it's also returns that were under pressure as well as the finance costs. So over time, the returns have reduced and there's fewer institutional investors, but there's still, a good investment return to be had for the long-term investor in the fixed income side. The program's also been very successful from a local content and jobs perspective. And I think from a jobs perspective, renewable energy plants are different from a large gas or coal-fired plant in the sense that in operations, they need fewer people to run because you don't have a whole thermal fuel system that you're managing. However, if you have a recurring renewable energy program, which is the current policy thinking, you will have quite a high number of jobs in construction, which are very skilled jobs. And what we're seeing now is, especially on the wind side, is a whole new supply chain of service providers coming up doing, for instance, blade maintenance. And in construction over the first 10 years, the renewable energy sector made a commitment to government in its bid, and it outperformed that by 143%, which is the number on the top right. So it's measured in job years, and it was 48,000. And I think that's quite a significant achievement. But, when it comes back to load shedding, how has renewable energy done? And this is the thing about a 100 megawatt wind farm or 100 megawatt solar project doesn't generate at the 100 megawatts because the wind only blows some of the time, or the solar park obviously only during the day. What I've graphed here on the top left, or the CSIR has looked at, and they do a very detailed study, including an analysis of load shedding. And this chart is summing up the brown here is the coal generation for 2021. And this is by different technology. And I've tried to group nuclear, diesel, and gas, which includes the peaking plants on the coast, which Eskom runs, hydro, which is not pump storage, which is separate. And then here, wind, solar, and CSP, or concentrating solar. And you can see how there's a jump up in renewables as more projects have come online. Some of the round 4 projects, round 3s that were delayed. And now we're building, hopefully, the next round of risk mitigation projects in round 5 before the end of the year. And this percentage is set to increase. And gradually, you'll see it taking up a bigger share because, that's our long-term energy policy at the moment. But you can see that compared to Kubag and the peakers and the gas and hydro plants that we're running, renewables is also making a bigger contribution as a percentage of the total generation mix compared to coal. The other interesting thing about renewables is even though you would think that the solar plant doesn't start generating until the sun is out in full force, that's not the case. So as early as you have sunlight at the plant, which can be as early as 5:30, even in winter on some of our projects, you'll see that this chart is showing the 2 ringed areas here are what we call the morning peak and the evening peak, which is when most users demand energy from the generation system. That's when the entire system or Eskom system is more vulnerable to load shedding. And 16% of the generation of wind and solar combined is provided during those peaks. So it's providing quite a meaningful input into the system. And I think the big trick for a lot of systems throughout the world, California, for instance, which has one of the most mature renewable energy generation networks, is now trying to work out what's the right mix of technology to manage that. Is it batteries or is it gas? And in a country like South Africa, I think that's going to be very interesting. Globeleq's view is that gas is the best technology to do that. And the key question is, how do you secure gas at a reasonable price? Maybe, for instance, in partnership with our neighbor Mozambique would make sense. And we're saying that because we've just also executed a new project in Mozambique, and we understand that Mozambique's got a lot of potential to trade its gas with a country like South Africa. And then just my last few slides, I think wind is generally less reliable compared to forecast. It's more variable in the short term than solar. The construction times, you can see in the chart on the left, roughly 2 years, but the key issue at the moment, the constraint is around the grid. Is the grid available? And what we hear from Eskom is the capacity on the left of that red line is now gone. So we've got to move renewable energy build to the areas on the right-hand side. But the challenge is, Eskom says it's got the funding, but it's got to secure the servitudes. And that's a real challenge because a lot of landowners in that area don't trust Eskom. So Craig, from a time perspective, to have a couple of minutes left.
Yes, Dhesen, another 2 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks. So I think in conclusion, that's a summary of all the positives about renewable energy, but the chart on the left-hand side is the integrated resource plan as it's currently drafted, and it's due for revision next year. Some of the things that are going to change is that Eskom's fleet is underperforming, and that will change in the assumptions. There's also this opening for a rapid ramp up in private generation. And what I think is underestimated is the amount of private consumers who have put a battery or solar and inverter in their own homes. The picture on the right is what we should bear in mind when we think about renewable energy and how it can solve things, which is by 2050, 12 large Eskom power plants are going to shut down. They're going to shut down because of the environmental constraints, as well as the fact that they are simply too old to run. And that's one of the reasons we're experiencing so much load shedding. So where does it leave us? It leaves us with Eskom now for the first time in 20 years of renewable energy in South Africa saying that renewable energy on a large scale is the way to go. You can't do new coal because it's going to take too long to solve load shedding, and Eskom can't raise finance for it, neither can South Africa. But the bigger urgency is because now, having done the climate change impact analysis, South Africa understands that it needs to build about 50 gigawatts of renewable energy, which is going to take about 1 trillion rand. And we estimate that that is where the big, investment opportunity lies. So the products are not there for retail investors, but you should email your fund manager to ask them when they're going to start looking at offering them. And for me, these are the key messages. There's been 2 decades of poor decisions, which has resulted in load shedding. Eskom's fleet will continue to be unreliable because it's difficult to correct that curve. Eskom is going to be shutting down its coal fleet as planned because there's no flexibility. And I think renewables will dominate long-term generation mix of the country, but the next decade will be rocky. So if you haven't already invested in a system to protect yourself from load shedding from 4 hours, you should. And then there's a massive opportunity on the private side. That's it. Thank you, Craig.